Welcome back. I am Pemberton, and this is part 3 of Josephus's wars. The young Herod shows his teeth early, crushing the brigands of Galilee and surviving a trial for his life. Then disaster: the Parthians pour into Syria, set the rival Antigonus on the throne, capture old Hyrcanus and crop his ear so he can never be high priest again, and drive Herod out. But Herod does the unexpected: he sails to Rome, and there Antony and Octavian and the Senate, with a single vote, make the fugitive Idumean king of the Jews. He comes back to conquer a kingdom that is his only on paper, beginning with the robbers in the cliff caves of Arbela. Let us go on.
At this time a mighty war arose among the Romans because Cassius and Brutus had suddenly and treacherously killed Caesar, after he had held the government for 3 years and 7 months. After this murder there were very great disturbances, and the leading men were deeply divided from one another. Each man joined the party where he had the greatest hope of advancing himself. Accordingly Cassius came into Syria in order to receive the forces at Apamea. There he brought about a reconciliation between Bacchus, Marcus, and the legions that were at odds with him. So he raised the siege of Apamea, took command of the army, and went about exacting tribute from the cities, demanding money from them to a degree they could not bear. Cassius commanded the Jews to bring in 700 talents. Antipater, fearing Cassius's threats, divided the raising of this sum among his sons and among others of his acquaintance, and ordered it to be done immediately. Among them he also required one Malichus, who was hostile to him, to do his part, which necessity forced him to do. Herod was the first to calm Cassius's anger by bringing his share from Galilee, which was 100 talents. Because of this, he was in the highest favor with Cassius. When Cassius reproached the rest for being slow, he became angry at the cities themselves. He enslaved Gophanas and 2 other cities of less note. He even proceeded as though he would kill Malichus because he had not been quicker in exacting his tribute. But Antipater prevented this man's ruin, and the ruin of the other cities, and gained Cassius's favor by immediately bringing in 100 talents. However, when Cassius was gone, Malichus forgot the kindness Antipater had shown him and laid repeated plots against the man who had saved him. He was eager to remove Antipater, who stood in the way of his wicked practices. Antipater was so afraid of the man's power and cunning that he went beyond Jordan to gather an army to guard himself against Malichus's treacherous designs. But when Malichus was caught in his plot, he used his impudence to impose on Antipater's sons. He thoroughly deceived Phasaelus, who was guardian of Jerusalem, and Herod, who was entrusted with the weapons of war, using many excuses and oaths, and persuaded them to secure his reconciliation with their father. Thus Malichus was again preserved by Antipater, who dissuaded Marcus, then president of Syria, from his resolution to kill Malichus because of his attempts at revolution. When the war arose between Cassius and Brutus on one side and the younger Caesar, Augustus, and Antony on the other, Cassius and Marcus gathered an army out of Syria. Because Herod was likely to have a great share in providing necessities, they made him procurator of all Syria and gave him an army of foot soldiers and horsemen. Cassius also promised him that after the war was over he would make him king of Judea. But it happened that the power and hopes of Antipater's son became the cause of Antipater's destruction. Malichus was afraid of this, so he bribed one of the king's cupbearers to give Antipater a poisoned drink. Thus Antipater became a sacrifice to Malichus's wickedness and died at a feast. In other respects he had been a man active in the management of affairs, one who recovered the government for Hyrcanus and preserved it in his hands. When Malichus was suspected of poisoning Antipater, and the multitude was angry with him because of it, he denied the charge and persuaded the people that he was not guilty. He also prepared to make a greater figure and raise soldiers, for he did not think Herod would remain quiet. Herod did indeed come against him at once with an army in order to avenge his father's death. But when he heard the advice of his brother Phasaelus not to punish Malichus openly, lest the multitude fall into sedition, Herod accepted Malichus's apology and declared that he cleared him of that suspicion. He also held a splendid funeral for his father. Then Herod went to Samaria, which was then in disorder, and settled the city in peace. After this, at the Pentecost festival, he returned to Jerusalem with his armed men. At the request of Malichus, who feared Herod's reproach, Hyrcanus forbade them to bring foreigners in to mingle with the people of the country while they were purifying themselves. But Herod despised both the pretense and the man who gave the command, and came in by night. Then Malichus came to him and lamented Antipater. Herod also made him believe that he accepted these lamentations as sincere, though he had great difficulty restraining his anger toward him. Yet Herod did bewail the murder of his father in his letters to Cassius, who for other reasons also hated Malichus. Cassius sent word back that Herod should avenge his father's death on Malichus, and he privately ordered the tribunes under him to assist Herod in the righteous action he was undertaking. When Cassius took Laodicea, powerful men gathered from all quarters with presents and crowns in their hands. Herod chose this time to punish Malichus. Malichus suspected this, and while he was at Tyre he resolved to withdraw his son secretly from among the Tyrians, where the boy was held as a hostage while he prepared to flee into Judea. The despair he felt over escaping drove him to think of greater things. He hoped to raise the nation in revolt from the Romans while Cassius was busy with the war against Antony, and then easily depose Hyrcanus and get the crown for himself. But fate laughed at his hopes. Herod foresaw what Malichus was so eager to do and invited both Hyrcanus and Malichus to supper. Then he called one of the principal servants standing by him and sent him out, as though to prepare things for supper, but in reality to give advance notice about the plot laid against Malichus. Accordingly, the men remembered the orders Cassius had given them, went out of the city with swords in their hands to the seashore, surrounded Malichus, and killed him with many wounds. Hyrcanus was immediately so frightened by the surprise that he swooned and fell down. With difficulty he recovered, and then asked who had killed Malichus. Then Cassius has saved both me and my country by cutting off a man who was plotting against them both. One of the tribunes had replied that it was done by the command of Cassius. Whether Hyrcanus spoke according to his own feelings, or whether his fear was so great that he felt forced to praise the action, is uncertain. However, by this method Herod inflicted punishment on Malichus. When Cassius left Syria, another sedition arose at Jerusalem. In it Felix attacked Phasaelus with an army, intending to avenge the death of Malichus upon Herod by attacking his brother. Herod happened then to be with Flavius, the governor of Damascus, and as he was going to help his brother, he was detained by sickness. Meanwhile, Phasaelus by himself proved too strong for Felix. He reproached Hyrcanus for his ingratitude, both for the assistance he had given Malichus and for overlooking Malichus's brother when that man seized the fortresses. He had already taken many of them, including Masada, the strongest of all. Still, nothing could be sufficient for Felix against the force of Herod. As soon as Herod recovered, he took back the other fortresses and drove Felix out of Masada in the posture of a supplicant. He also drove Marion, the tyrant of the Tyrians, out of Galilee, after Marion had already taken possession of 3 fortified places. As for the Tyrians Herod caught, he preserved them all alive. He even gave presents to some of them and sent them away, thereby gaining goodwill for himself from the city and hatred toward the tyrant. Marion had obtained his tyrannical power from Cassius, who set tyrants over all Syria. Out of hatred for Herod, Marion assisted Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus, chiefly on account of Flavius, whom Antigonus had made his helper by money, and thus had on his side when he made his descent. But it was Ptolemy, the kinsman of Antigonus, who supplied all that he needed. When Herod fought against them in the avenues of Judea, he won the battle, drove Antigonus away, and returned to Jerusalem beloved by everyone for the glorious action he had done. Those who had not favored him before now joined themselves to him because of his marriage into the family of Hyrcanus. He had formerly married a wife from his own country, of no ignoble blood, named Doris, by whom he begot Antipater. Now he married Mariamne, the daughter of Alexander, the son of Aristobulus, and the granddaughter of Hyrcanus, and by this he became a relation of the king. But when Caesar and Antony had killed Cassius near Philippi, Caesar went to Italy and Antony to Asia. Among the other cities that sent ambassadors to Antony in Bithynia, the great men of the Jews also came and accused Phasaelus and Herod, saying that they held the government by force, and that Hyrcanus had nothing more than an honorable name. Herod appeared ready to answer this accusation, and by the large sums of money he gave Antony, he made Antony his friend and brought him to such a temper that he would not hear the others speak against him. Thus they parted at that time. After this, however, 100 of the principal men among the Jews came to Antony at Daphne near Antioch, when he was already enslaved by his love for Cleopatra. These Jews put forward the men who were most powerful in dignity and eloquence, and they accused the brothers. But Messala opposed them and defended the brothers, while Hyrcanus stood by him because of his relation to them. When Antony had heard both sides, he asked Hyrcanus which party was fittest to govern. Hyrcanus replied that Herod and his party were fittest. Antony was glad at that answer, for he had formerly been treated hospitably and kindly by their father Antipater when he marched into Judea with Gabinius. So he appointed the brothers tetrarchs and entrusted the government of Judea to them. When the ambassadors were indignant at this procedure, Antony took 15 of them and put them in custody, and he was about to kill them at once, while he drove the rest away with disgrace. Because of this, a still greater tumult arose at Jerusalem. So they again sent 1,000 ambassadors to Tyre, where Antony was now staying as he marched to Jerusalem. When these men made a clamor, Antony sent out the governor of Tyre and ordered him to punish all of them he could catch, and to establish in the administration those whom he had made tetrarchs. But before this, Herod and Hyrcanus went out to the seashore and earnestly urged these ambassadors not to bring ruin upon themselves or war upon their native country by their rash disputes. When the ambassadors grew still more outrageous, Antony sent out armed men and killed many of them and wounded more. Hyrcanus buried those who were killed and placed the wounded under the care of physicians. Yet those who escaped still would not remain quiet, but threw the affairs of the city into such disorder and so provoked Antony that he also killed those whom he had in bonds. 2 years later, Barzapharnes, a governor among the Parthians, and Pacorus, the king's son, had taken possession of Syria. Lysanias had already succeeded to the government of Chalcis after the death of his father Ptolemy, the son of Menneus. Lysanias persuaded the governor, by promising 1,000 talents and 500 women, to bring Antigonus back to his kingdom and to drive Hyrcanus out of it. Pacorus was induced by these means to do this. He marched along the seacoast, while he ordered Phasaelus to attack the Jews as he went through the Mediterranean part of the country. Among the maritime people, the Tyrians would not receive Pacorus, though those of Ptolemais and Sidon had received him. So he entrusted a troop of horse to a certain cupbearer of the royal family, who had the same name Pacorus, and ordered him to march into Judea, learn the state of affairs among their enemies, and help Antigonus whenever he needed assistance. As these men were ravaging Carmel, many of the Jews gathered to Antigonus and showed themselves ready to make an incursion into the country. So he sent them ahead to the place called Drymus, the woodland, to seize it. A battle was fought there, and they drove the enemy away, pursued them, and ran after them as far as Jerusalem. As their numbers increased, they advanced as far as the king's palace. But Hyrcanus and Phasaelus received them with a strong body of men, and a battle took place in the marketplace. Herod's party defeated the enemy, shut them up in the temple, and placed 60 men in the adjoining houses as a guard over them. But the people who were in tumult against the brothers came in and burned those men. Herod, enraged that they had been killed, attacked and killed many of the people. Then the parties made incursions on one another by turns, day after day, by ambushes, and slaughters continually occurred among them. When the festival called Pentecost was near, all the places around the temple and the whole city were filled with a multitude of people who had come from the country, most of them armed. At that time Phasaelus guarded the wall, and Herod, with a few men, guarded the royal palace. When Herod assaulted his enemies while they were out of order on the north side of the city, he killed a very great number of them and put them all to flight. Some he shut up within the city, and others within the outer rampart. Meanwhile Antigonus asked that Pacorus be admitted as a reconciler between them. Phasaelus was persuaded to admit the Parthian into the city with 500 horsemen, and to treat him hospitably. Pacorus pretended that he had come to quiet the tumult, but in reality he came to help Antigonus. He laid a plot for Phasaelus, and persuaded him to go as an ambassador to Phasaelus in order to end the war. Herod was very earnest against this and urged Phasaelus to kill the plotter instead of exposing himself to the snares laid for him, because barbarians are naturally treacherous. Nevertheless Pacorus went out and took Hyrcanus with him, so that he might be less suspected. He also left some of the horsemen, called the freemen, with Herod, and conducted Phasaelus with the rest. When they came to Galilee, they found that the people of that country had revolted and were in arms. These people came very cunningly to their leader and begged him to hide his treacherous intentions by treating them kindly. Accordingly he first made them presents, and afterward, as they went away, laid ambushes for them. When they came to one of the maritime cities called Ectopon, they perceived that a plot had been laid for them. They were informed there of the promised 1,000 talents, and how Antigonus had devoted the greater number of the women who were with them, among the 500, to the Parthians. They also perceived that the barbarians were always laying an ambush for them at night. They would already have been seized, except that the Parthians waited first for Herod to be seized at Jerusalem, because if he were once informed of their treachery, he would take care of himself. Nor was this a mere report, for they saw the guards already not far away from them. Phasaelus would not think of abandoning Hyrcanus and fleeing, though Flavius earnestly urged him to do so. Flavius had learned the whole design of the plot from Saramalla, the richest of all the Syrians. Instead, Phasaelus went up to the Parthian governor, and reproached him to his face for laying this treacherous plot against them, chiefly because he had done it for money. He promised that he would give him more money for their preservation than Antigonus had promised to give for the kingdom. But the sly Parthian tried to remove all suspicion with apologies and oaths, and then went to the other Pacorus. Immediately afterward, the Parthians who had been left there and had been charged with the task seized Phasaelus and Hyrcanus, who could do nothing more than curse their treachery and perjury. Meanwhile the cupbearer was sent back and laid a plan to seize Herod by deceiving him and getting him out of the city as he had been commanded. But Herod had suspected the barbarians from the beginning. Then, after he received intelligence that a messenger who was supposed to bring him letters informing him of the intended treachery had fallen among the enemy, he would not go out of the city. Pacorus insisted very positively that he ought to go out and meet the messengers who were bringing the letters, saying that the enemy had not taken them, and that the letters did not contain accounts of any plots against them, but only news of what Phasaelus had done. Yet Herod had heard from others that his brother had been seized. Alexandra, Hyrcanus's daughter, and the shrewdest woman in the world, begged him not to go out or trust himself to those barbarians, who had now come to make an open attempt against him. As Pacorus and his friends were considering how they might carry out their plot secretly, because it was impossible to entrap a man of such prudence by attacking him openly, Herod moved first. By night, without his enemies knowing it, he left with those most closely related to him. As soon as the Parthians perceived this, they pursued them. Herod ordered his mother, his sister, the young woman betrothed to him, her mother, and his youngest brother to make the best of their way, while he himself, with his servants, took every care to hold off the barbarians. At every assault he killed many of them, and so he came to the stronghold of Masada. Indeed, he found by experience that the Jews fell on him more heavily than the Parthians did, and they caused him constant trouble from the time he was 60 furlongs from the city. Sometimes these attacks came close to a regular battle. In the place where Herod defeated them and killed a great number, he afterward built a citadel in memory of the great actions he had done there. He adorned it with the most costly palaces, erected very strong fortifications, and named it Herodium after himself. As they fled, many people joined him every day. At a place called Thressa in Idumea, his brother Joseph met him, and advised him to lighten himself of many of his followers, because Masada would not hold so great a multitude, which was more than 9,000. Herod followed this advice, and sent away the most burdensome part of his retinue to go into Idumea, giving them provisions for the journey. But he himself reached the fortress safely with his closest relations, and kept with him only the strongest of his followers. There he left 800 of his men as a guard for the women, with provisions sufficient for a siege, while he himself hastened to Petra in Arabia. As for the Parthians in Jerusalem, they turned to plundering. They fell upon the houses of those who had fled and upon the king's palace, sparing nothing except Hyrcanus' money, which amounted to no more than 300 talents. They found other men's money also, but not as much as they hoped, because Herod had long suspected the treachery of the barbarians, and had taken care to have the most splendid parts of his treasure conveyed into Idumea. Everyone belonging to him had done the same. But the Parthians went to such a degree of injustice that they filled the whole country with war without declaring it, demolished the city Marissa, and not only set up Antigonus as king, but delivered Phasaelus and Hyrcanus bound into his hands so that they might be tormented by him. Antigonus himself bit off Hyrcanus' ears with his own teeth as Hyrcanus fell on his knees before him, so that, no matter how affairs might change, Hyrcanus could never again receive the high priesthood, since those who officiated as high priests had to be whole and without blemish. However, Antigonus failed in his purpose of abusing Phasaelus because of Phasaelus' courage. Though Phasaelus had command of neither his sword nor his hands, he prevented all abuses by dashing his head against a stone. In this way he showed himself to be truly Herod's brother, and Hyrcanus to be a most degenerate relation. He died with great bravery, and made the end of his life match its actions. There is also another report about his death, that he recovered from that blow, and that a surgeon sent by Antigonus to heal him filled the wound with poisonous ingredients and so killed him. Whichever death he came to, the beginning of it was glorious. It is also reported that before he expired, a certain poor woman informed him that Herod had escaped out of their hands, and that he then said, "I now die with comfort, since I leave behind me one alive who will avenge me on my enemies." This was the death of Phasaelus. But the Parthians, although they had failed to get the women they most desired, still put the government of Jerusalem into the hands of Antigonus, and took Hyrcanus away bound and carried him to Parthia. Herod pursued his journey into Arabia with greater zeal, because he was hurrying to get money from the king, while his brother was still alive. With that money alone he hoped to overcome the covetous temper of the barbarians, and persuade them to spare Phasaelus. He reasoned with himself that if the Arabian king was too forgetful of his father's friendship with him, and too greedy to make him a free gift, he would at least borrow from him enough to redeem his brother, and would place in his hands, as a pledge, the son of the man who was to be redeemed. Accordingly he led his brother's son along with him, a boy 7 years old. Herod was ready to give 300 talents for his brother, and he intended to ask the Tyrians to intercede so that the offer would be accepted. Yet fate had moved faster than his diligence. Since Phasaelus was dead, Herod's brotherly love was now in vain. Moreover, he could find no lasting friendship among the Arabians. Their king Malichus immediately sent to him and ordered him to return out of his country. Malichus used the name of the Parthians as a pretext, as though their ambassadors had warned him to cast Herod out of Arabia. In reality, the Arabians wanted to keep back what they owed Antipater and avoid making repayment to his sons for the free gifts their father had given them. Malichus also followed the imputed advice of those who, like himself, were willing to deprive Herod of what Antipater had deposited among them. These men were the most powerful of all those in his kingdom. When Herod found that the Arabians were his enemies for the very reasons he had hoped would make them most friendly, he gave them the answer his anger suggested, then turned back and went toward Egypt. On the first evening he lodged at one of the temples of that country in order to meet those he had left behind. But the next day, as he was going to Rhinocura, word was brought to him that his brother was dead and how he had died. After he lamented him as much as his present circumstances allowed, he soon laid aside such cares and continued his journey. After some time, the king of Arabia repented of what he had done and immediately sent messengers to call him back. But Herod had outpaced them and had come to Pelusium. There he could not obtain passage from those who lay with the fleet, so he begged their captains to let him pass by them. Out of respect for the man's fame and dignity, they conducted him to Alexandria. When he entered the city, Cleopatra received him with great splendor, hoping he might be persuaded to command her forces in the expedition she was now undertaking. But Herod rejected the queen's solicitations. Neither the height of the storm then occurring nor the tumults then in Italy frightened him, and he sailed for Rome. When Herod was in danger near Pamphylia and was forced to throw out the greatest part of the ship's cargo, he reached Rhodes only with difficulty. That place had been grievously harassed in the war with Cassius. There he was received by his friends Ptolemy and Sapinius. Although he was then in need of money, he fitted out a very large 3-decked ship in which he and his friends sailed to Brundusium, and from there he went to Rome with all speed. There he first went to Antony because of his father's friendship with him, and laid before him the calamities that had fallen on himself and his family. He told him that he had left his nearest relations besieged in a fortress, and had sailed to him through a storm to beg him for assistance. Antony was moved to pity by the change in Herod's fortunes, both because he remembered how hospitably Antipater had treated him, and still more because of Herod's own virtue. So he resolved to have Herod made king of the Jews, the same man whom he had formerly made tetrarch. His conflict with Antigonus was another inducement, no less weighty than Antony's regard for Herod, for Antony considered Antigonus a seditious person and an enemy of the Romans. As for Caesar, Herod found him even better prepared than Antony, because Caesar freshly remembered the wars he had gone through together with Herod's father, the hospitality he had received from him, and the complete goodwill he had shown him, besides the activity he saw in Herod himself. So Caesar called the Senate together. In the Senate Malichus, and after him Antigonus, brought Herod before them, and gave a full account of his father's merits, and of Herod's own goodwill toward the Romans. At the same time they showed that Antigonus was their enemy, not only because he had earlier quarreled with them, but because he now disregarded the Romans, and had taken the government by means of the Parthians. These arguments greatly moved the Senate. At that point Antony came in and told them that it was to their advantage in the Parthian war for Herod to be king. So they all gave their votes for it. When the Senate was dismissed, Antony and Caesar went out with Herod between them, while the consul and the other magistrates went before them to offer sacrifices and lay the decree in the Capitol. Antony also made a feast for Herod on the first day of his reign. During this time Antigonus besieged those who were in Masada. They had all other necessities in sufficient quantity, but they lacked water. Because of this, Joseph, Herod's brother, was inclined to flee to the Arabians with 200 of his own friends, since he had heard that Malichus repented of his offenses against Herod. He would already have gone out of the fortress, if on the very night he meant to leave a great deal of rain had not fallen, so that his reservoirs were filled with water, and he no longer needed to flee. After this they made an attack on Antigonus's party and killed many of them, some in open battles and some in private ambushes. Yet their attempts did not always succeed, for sometimes they were defeated and ran away. Meanwhile Ventidius, the Roman general, was sent out of Syria to restrain the incursions of the Parthians. After he had done this, he came into Judea, pretending to assist Joseph and his party, but in reality to get money from Antigonus. When he had pitched his camp very near Jerusalem, and had obtained enough money, he went away with the greater part of his forces. Still he left Silo with part of them, lest taking all the soldiers away make his bribery too openly discovered. Antigonus hoped that the Parthians would come again to his assistance, and therefore in the meantime he cultivated a good understanding with Silo, so that no interruption would be given to his hopes. By this time Herod had sailed out of Italy and come to Ptolemais. As soon as he had gathered a considerable army of foreigners and men of his own country, he marched through Galilee against Antigonus. He was assisted by Ventidius and Silo, both of whom Dellius, a man sent by Antony, persuaded to bring Herod into his kingdom. Ventidius was then among the cities, composing the disturbances that had been caused by the Parthians, while Silo was in Judea and had been corrupted by the bribes Antigonus had given him. Yet Herod himself was not without power. The number of his forces increased every day as he went along, and almost all Galilee joined him, with few exceptions. So he proposed to set about his most necessary enterprise, which was Masada, in order to deliver his relatives from the siege they were enduring. But Joppa stood in his way and hindered his going there, for it was necessary first to take that city, which was in the enemy's hands, so that when he went to Jerusalem no fortress would be left in the enemy's power behind him. Silo also willingly joined him, since he now had a plausible reason for drawing his forces away from Jerusalem. When the Jews pursued Silo and pressed upon him in his retreat, Herod made an excursion against them with a small body of his men, quickly put them to flight, and saved Silo when he was in distress. After this Herod took Joppa, and then hurried to Masada to free his relatives. As he marched, many came over to him. Some were moved by friendship for his father, some by the reputation Herod had already gained for himself, and some by a desire to repay benefits they had received from both of them. But what drew the greatest number to his side was their hope in him once he should be established in his kingdom. Thus he had already gathered an army that would be hard to conquer. Antigonus laid an ambush for him as he marched out, but did little or no harm to his enemies. Herod easily recovered his relatives in Masada, as well as the fortress Ressa, and then marched to Jerusalem. There the soldiers with Silo joined themselves to his own, as did many people from the city because they feared his power. When he pitched his camp on the west side of the city, the guards there shot arrows and threw darts at them, while others ran out in companies and attacked those in front. Herod ordered a proclamation to be made at the wall, saying that he had come for the good of the people and the preservation of the city, with no design to take revenge on his open enemies, but to grant forgetfulness even to those who had been most obstinate against him. But the soldiers who supported Antigonus made a contrary clamor and allowed no one either to hear the proclamation or to change sides. So Antigonus ordered his forces to beat the enemy from the walls. Accordingly, they soon threw darts at them from the towers and put them to flight. Here Silo revealed that he had taken bribes. He set many soldiers to clamor about their lack of necessities, to demand their pay so they could buy food, and to ask that he lead them to places convenient for winter quarters, because all the country around the city had been laid waste by Antigonus's army, which had taken everything away. By this he stirred the army and tried to get them away from the siege. But Herod went to the captains under Silo and to many of the soldiers, begging them not to leave him, since he had been sent there by Caesar, Antony, and the Senate, and saying that he would see to it that their needs were supplied that very day. After making this request, he quickly went into the country and brought back so great an abundance of necessities that he cut off all Silo's excuses. In order to ensure they would not lack supplies in the following days, he sent to the people around Samaria, a city that had joined him, commanding them to bring grain, wine, oil, and cattle to Jericho. When Antigonus heard this, he sent some of his party with orders to hinder these collectors of grain and lay ambushes for them. This command was obeyed. A great multitude of armed men gathered around Jericho and lay on the mountains to watch those bringing the provisions. Yet Herod was not idle. He took with him 10 cohorts, 5 Roman and 5 Jewish, along with some mercenary troops mixed among them and a few horsemen, and came to Jericho. When he arrived, he found the city deserted, but 500 men, with their wives and children, had taken possession of the mountain tops. He captured these and dismissed them. The Romans fell upon the rest of the city and plundered it, having found the houses full of all sorts of good things. So the king left to garrison at Jericho and returned. He sent the Roman army into the cities that had come over to him to take their winter quarters there, namely into Judea, Idumea, Galilee, and Samaria. Antigonus also obtained from Silo, by bribes, permission for part of his army to be received at Lydda as a compliment to Antonius. So the Romans lived in plenty of everything and rested from war. Herod, however, did not rest. He seized Idumea and held it with 2,000 footmen and 400 horsemen. He did this by sending his brother Joseph there, so that Antigonus could make no new disturbance. He also moved his mother and all his relations, who had been in Masada, to Samaria. After he had settled them securely, he marched to take the remaining parts of Galilee, and to drive away the garrisons Antigonus had placed there. When Herod reached Sepphoris in a very heavy snow, he took the city without difficulty, because the guards who should have defended it fled before it was attacked. There he gave his followers, who had been in distress, an opportunity to refresh themselves, for the city held a great abundance of necessities. After this he hurried away against the robbers in the caves, who overran a large part of the country and did as much harm to its inhabitants as war itself could have done. Accordingly, he sent ahead 3 cohorts of footmen and 1 troop of horsemen to the village Arbela, and 40 days later he came himself with the rest of his forces. Yet the enemy was not frightened by his attack, but met him in arms. Their skill was that of warriors, but their boldness was the boldness of robbers. When the battle was set, the right wing put Herod's left wing to flight. But Herod suddenly wheeled around from his own right wing, and came to the aid of his left. He made his fleeing left wing turn back, and then fell upon the pursuers, cooling their courage until they could no longer endure the direct attacks made on them. So they turned and ran away. Herod followed them, killed them as he pursued, and destroyed a great part of them, until the survivors were scattered beyond the river Jordan. Galilee was freed from the terrors it had been under, except for those men who remained hidden in caves and required a longer time before they could be conquered. To prepare for that, Herod first distributed the fruits of their former labors to the soldiers. He gave each one 150 drachmae of silver, and much more to their commanders, and sent them into winter quarters. He also sent to his youngest brother Phasaelus, instructing him to provide a good market where they could buy provisions, and to build a wall around Alexandrium. Phasaelus carried out both commands. Meanwhile Antony stayed at Athens, while Ventidius called for Silo and Herod to come to the war against the Parthians, but ordered them first to settle the affairs of Judea. Herod willingly dismissed Silo to go to Ventidius, but he himself made an expedition against those who lay in the caves. These caves were in the precipices of craggy mountains, and could not be reached from any side, since the only paths up to them were winding and very narrow. The rock in front of them had beneath it valleys of vast depth and almost perpendicular descent. Because of this, the king was uncertain for a long time what to do, since attacking the place seemed nearly impossible. At last Herod used a plan that involved the greatest danger. He lowered the hardiest of his men in chests and set them at the mouths of the dens. These men killed the robbers and their families, and when the robbers resisted, they sent fire in against them and burned them. Because Herod wished to save some of them, he had a proclamation made that they should come out and surrender to him. But not one of them came willingly, and of those who were compelled to come, many preferred death to captivity. There was a certain old man, the father of 7 children, whose children and their mother asked him to let them go out under the assurance and right hand offered to them. He killed them in this way. He ordered each of them to go out, while he himself stood at the cave's mouth and killed each son as he went out. Herod was close enough to see this sight, and his compassion was stirred. He stretched out his right hand to the old man and begged him to spare his children. But the man did not relent at all. Instead, he also reproached Herod for the lowness of his descent, killed his wife as well as his children, threw their dead bodies down the precipice, and finally threw himself down after them. By this means Herod subdued these caves and the robbers in them. He left their part of his army, as many as he thought sufficient to prevent any sedition, and made Ptolemy their general. Then he returned to Samaria, leading with him 3,000 armed footmen and 600 horsemen against Antigonus. After Herod's departure, those who used to raise tumults in Galilee took advantage of their liberty and unexpectedly fell upon Ptolemy, the general of his forces, and killed him. They also laid the country waste, then withdrew into bogs and places not easily found. But when Herod was informed of this insurrection, he immediately came to the aid of the country. He destroyed a great number of the seditious men, raised the sieges of all the fortresses they had besieged, and exacted a tribute of 100 talents from his enemies as a penalty for the changes they had made in the country. By this time the Parthians had already been driven out of the country and Pacorus had been killed. By Antony's command, then Titius sent Herod 1,000 horsemen and 2 legions as auxiliaries against Antigonus. Antigonus wrote to Machaerus, who was their general, begging him to come to his assistance. He made many mournful complaints about Herod's violence and the injuries he was doing to the kingdom, and he promised to give Machaerus money for his help. But Machaerus would not accept his invitation to betray his trust, for he did not disregard the man who had sent him, especially since Herod gave him more money than Antigonus offered. So he pretended friendship toward Antigonus, but came as a spy to discover his affairs, although in this he did not follow Herod's advice, for Herod had tried to dissuade him from doing so. Antigonus perceived his intentions beforehand, excluded him from the city, and defended himself against him from the walls as against an enemy. At last Machaerus was ashamed of what he had done and withdrew to Herod at Emmaus. In his rage at his disappointment, he killed all the Jews he met, sparing not even those who were for Herod, but treating them all as if they were for Antigonus. Herod was very angry at Machaerus, and was about to fight him as an enemy, but he restrained his indignation and marched to Antony to accuse Machaerus of maladministration. Machaerus realized his offenses, followed the king immediately, and earnestly begged for reconciliation, which he obtained. Even so, Herod did not give up his decision to go to Antony. When he heard that Antony was besieging Samosata with a great army, a strong city near Euphrates, he hurried even more, seeing this as a proper opportunity both to show his courage and to do something that would greatly oblige Antony. Indeed, when he arrived, he soon brought that siege to an end, killed a great number of the barbarians, and took a large amount of plunder from them. Antony, who had admired his courage before, now admired it still more. Accordingly, he heaped many more honors on him, and gave him more assured hopes that he would gain his kingdom. And now King Antiochus was forced to surrender Samosata.
And there we leave Herod king in name, fighting his way across Galilee toward Jerusalem, and the rival still seated in it. Next time, in part 4, the great siege of Herod and the Roman Sosius take Jerusalem by storm. The last Hasmonean king is put to death, and Herod must then face the deadliest enemy of all, Cleopatra. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.